Hello, and welcome back to Global Perspectives in Climate Migration. My name is James K. Holder II, and today we're looking at Module 4, which is going to focus primarily on flood risk in informal settlements. One thing I want to be keenly aware of as we enter this module is that a lot of the material is a little bit older. So they might use terms to describe different types of developments in different ways. So our course is going to stick to the phrase informal settlement. As you do additional research or look at the sources, you might see them use other terms that I won't really go into that some might consider offensive. So just be mindful that that could be something that comes up. As we go along, just as we've seen in other elements of our work and other modules before, the informal settlements are going to have compounded vulnerabilities. This might consider housing challenges, but also different levels of drainage capacity and systems that allow for proper drainage that might contribute to floods in those areas. Climate change is also, as usual, acting as an amplifier or is compounding the threats and challenges associated with existing infrastructure failures, right? And then when we talk about, as we've seen before, different levels of climate change can also influence movements within certain communities or within countries. And so rapid urbanization, which is something that comes as a function of drought, can also contribute to infrastructure challenges within urban developments and can compound the risk associated with flooding. Informal settlements often develop within floodplains. So these are low-lying areas that tend to be along riverbanks that are susceptible to flooding due to sea level rise, storms, and also hydrological or meteorological elements of precipitation. So just rain itself can also create flooding in these areas. And over the course of the lecture, we're going to discuss like different elements and challenges that contribute to this problem. We know that the World Bank estimates as of 2016 that over 880 million people live in informal settlements, many of them directly in these types of floodplains. This is particularly interesting in our research because when individuals migrate across across borders, they often find themselves, more often than not, find themselves in these types of communities. So this is a part of the resilience conversation as well as the migration conversation that we need to be mindful of. So this is becoming an urban planning issue. This is a migration issue. This is a climate issue. It's really condensed and complex. So jumping into defining flood risk in informal settlements, we have two diagrams which we'll look at in a moment, but I want to discuss flood risks as a function of hazard times exposure times vulnerability, and I want us to look at each one of those terms on their own. So hazards are anything that could contribute to sort of that hydrological impact, right? So we're talking about rainfall, storms. Storms, of course, could be typhoons or hurricanes, but just intense rainfall can factor into that. And also flooding along rivers. Exposure is really the amount of people or concentration of people and assets along those floodplains, right? And then vulnerability is sort of the inadequate housing or lack of drainage, limited adaptive capacity. So those three things that factor in to make the challenge of urban or flooding in informal settlements sort of the biggest challenge. So I want to start at the top. We've got vulnerability, which speaks directly to social and economic and also environmental issues. You've got the hazards, which could factor into any sort of earth or atmospheric situation, okay? And then we've got exposure, which is about the people themselves. And all of those three things combined essentially illustrate what the disaster risk is. And there's another triangle here. There's another diagram here at the bottom that kind of is one that you just have to kind of look at and visualize. A triangle where one side is a hazard, One is vulnerability, one is exposure, but this is not necessarily an equilateral triangle. What it's basically showcasing is that as you reduce exposure, the amount of risk um, reduces. Or as you reduce any one of the sides of the triangle, the amount of risk reduces. And likely, if you expand any one of those, the risk also increases. So it's just a matter of like thinking, if you draw it out, if you look and analyze that the exposure is increasing, meaning the concentration of people is increasing in an area, then the risk associated with that area is also increasing. Drivers of flood and vulnerability. So there's overlapping structural drivers, as we've discussed before. They could have anything to do with sanitation, infrastructure, and poor drainage, to existing encroachment on wetlands, estuaries, riverbanks. So as people are settling in areas that aren't opportune for development, then you're going to see more of this. Insecure tenure discourages durable housing investments. So when we talk about this informal settlement term, we're essentially saying people don't have necessarily formal deeds or insurance or some of the things that are really structurally connected to property ownership. And as a result, there's not as much of an investment or interest in protecting the investment, protecting the land around, making sure that there are proper drainage or proper structures themselves. And that can lead to a whole host of issues, but ultimately that sort of that uh, felicitous nature of development is also leading to lack of sort of durable resources in those communities. Okay. And then we've got lack of early warning and emergency response systems, which we've also discussed in our projects. Just that could factor into use of languages within disaster communications. It could be a number of reasons why those systems potentially fail certain communities. So the lack of urban warning systems, or the lack of early warning systems, ultimately is another disparity that disproportionately harms the urban poor, and creates additional vulnerabilities, which increases the overall risk associated. Now let's look a little bit at governance and how it factors in to this situation. When we talk about informal settlements, we're also talking about a lack of official recognition. So this is, factoring into no zoning, no investment in systems that are ultimately going to protect the societies that live there. We don't have investments in proper drainage. And let's forget transportation. That we know that's a big part of evacuation capacity. But ultimately, we're having these challenges that are going to be sort of mounting and compounding. Relocation policies are going to uproot livelihoods and social networks. So we'll get into this a little bit later, but the reluctance to relocate after flooding is really significant amongst poor and these types of communities that we're studying in this lecture. And then, as we've seen in previous lectures, most specifically the last lecture, the failure to govern is also a massive driver of displacement. So let's look at this 6 phases of disaster cycle here. This is basically speaking to a forecast and warning system that happens in concurrence with a disaster itself. As that process moves along, we go into emergency planning, stockpiled supplies, which is in the response phase. Along the recovery phase, we're really discussing need for transitional housing, small business assistance, and insurance. We've seen these sort of roll out in the United States very effectively during things like Hurricane Sandy, or even hurricanes in the Southeast that we've seen in most recent years. So within the reconstruction phase, we're talking about improved land use, zoning, building codes, craftsman training. So there should be this evolution as we move along. And as people are moving back in, they're moving into safer communities because the governance is understanding and implementing new policies to make sure that the same types of flaws that existed in the previous evacuations or during the previous threats are not continuing to cause problems moving forward. Um, and then we're looking at sort of retrofitting resources, increasing education, better building practices, and ultimately leading to finally emergency planning and exercises and education. So this is a very detailed cycle of that sort of disaster process. Now I want to discuss the next phase of this, which hadn't been discussed before, really up until now, health and flood risk. But this is really consistent with almost all types of risks and all types of migration. Floods themselves contribute to health risks because of waterborne disease, cholera, dengue. Floodwaters contaminate open sewers and water supplies, and we'll see that a little bit more, how that becomes so dangerous moving forward. Um, the long-term effects ultimately lead to malnutrition, stunting of children's growth, and we can even speak to those types of occurrences in the United States. If you think of the contamination in pipelines in Flint, Michigan, that created all kinds of issues for children of that community. Floods disrupt access to healthcare and medications and supply chains around healthcare. So that's a really big thing I want to note here. Clinics may be damaged, roads may be cut off, giving like less access to healthcare when it's needed the most. And this makes it harder for people with chronic conditions like diabetes, hypertension, or HIV to maintain their existing treatment plans. Now, one study that I found that actually is from this year, from 2025, discusses the mental health challenges and propensity of disasters to create and exacerbate issues around mental health itself. The risk that we're seeing when it comes to floods specifically in older adults, this study is of older adults, we're seeing that there's a sense of place of belonging, isolation, and network support or lack of information. And the ultimate, the study finds that people who experience these can oftentimes exhibit symptoms of PTSD, depression, anxiety, and even sleep problems as a result. So this is specifically like river flooding, long-term and large-scale rainfall. So as we move along, I want us to be very mindful that health should be seen as a comprehensive term, and that we want to be considering mental health challenges and impacts in the design of interventions for emergency or evacuation systems and also migration planning as well. So now we're looking at more of a global context. And for this example, we're really only looking at global South examples. But I still want everyone to be sort of open to the fact that we do see flooding in the global North. But in South America, we've seen sort of hillside developments face landslides because of flash floods. In Haiti, compounding with earthquakes, we've seen flooding from weakened infrastructure. This often leads to temporary displacement, and with flooding, as it continues to happen over and over again, it leads to rural to urban displacement or vice versa, and also international migration. So let's look at Africa and Asia now. So in Bangladesh, we're looking at monsoon flooding, waterlogging, and dense informal settlements. So similar to our case study, which is coming up with Kibera, Kenya. Seasonal river flooding destroys homes and contaminates the water. So again, when we're talking about seasonal, that's more of a planned flooding. But I also want to highlight, as we'll see in the rest of the lecture, that there are compounding effects of climate change that are making even seasonal and expected occurrences, sort of like flooding, um, more problematic and more dangerous. The key themes of flood vulnerability include poverty and marginalization amplify disaster risk. We want to know that community participation in planning and resilience is key to building sustainable communities despite these challenges. And then relocation is often unsustainable or unjust. Now, I want to discuss a little bit about the interconnectedness. Flooding is rarely an isolated hazard. It interacts with other chronic stresses to produce cascading impacts. So as we're looking here on this diagram, I want to kind of showcase and highlight just what we're seeing here. When you have development along a coastline, as sea level rises, this is actually a graph or a diagram taken from the San Francisco Bay Area, but it discusses the interaction of floodwater, sea level rise, precipitation, along with rivers and creek systems that ultimately connect with fresh groundwater that can be now contaminated because of household waste and also industrial waste. If there aren't appropriate systems in place to prevent that cross contamination from happening, there might also be health impacts that are directly connected to the oversaturation of groundwater, which prevents proper runoff and then flooding of the streets themselves and the communities themselves. So now we're going to our case study, formally, Kibera, Nairobi. And this is like, again, a massive settlement in Kenya. This is an informal settlement that is measured, estimated to be anywhere from 500,000 people, anywhere between 250,000 to 500,000 people live in this community. We'll show a photo of it in the next slide. But this is one of the most well-documented examples of climate-related flooding and informal settlements. And this is located again in Kenya. Seasonal rains and El Nino events produce recurrent floods that damage housing, contaminate drinking water, and displace thousands each year. Again, we're talking about that triangle of risk assessment. As you increase that population and the density of that area, it's going to be an increase in that risk itself. So this is a photograph. This photograph is from Wikipedia, actually. And you can see just the sheer density of this community. Density like this without proper egress planning, without proper transportation, without proper sewage, drainage is definitely like queued up for a lot of different challenges and susceptible to multiple risks along the way. So let's continue on, but I just wanted to show that photo for some perspective. So along with this community, informal settlements, informal housing, which have weak foundations, vulnerable to collapse. We've also got blocked drains and choked rivers for worsened flooding. And lastly, we've got limited access to safe drinking water after the floods. So the key note here is that housing in these areas is typically constructed with mud or wood and also corrugated iron sheets. And these materials are not really designed to withstand prolonged exposure to floodwaters. So that becomes a challenge in and of itself. But then we also have risk mapping within a community-led adaptation and things that we see communities doing now to protect and make this area more sustainable for the future is risk mapping and community awareness campaigns. Also, building elevated walkways and improved drainage pilots. And then lastly, rainwater harvesting and flood preparedness efforts. So despite the overall governance neglect, there is still community work being done in these areas to help protect people and make it more livable for the future. So I want to look at the geography of this migration when it comes to flooding. And right here, we're looking at detection, characterization, and analysis of land subsidence in Nairobi. So land subsidence is a lowering of land along sort of riverbanks or coast lines. And what this map is showing, this is from a paper, I will put the details in here, but this is basically showing on this scale here in the bright red, you can see land is going to be reducing by an annual rate of 28 millimeters. And this is along this river and this dam system. And so in the brightest red area is the topic of our case study and Kibera in Nairobi, Kenya. And so 28 millimeters, I'm not the best with metric conversions, but that's approximately 1 inch, just slightly over 1 inch. Going into, that's about 1.2 actually, 1.2 inches dropping of the whole landmass every year. Flood displacement in informal settlements is often cyclical. If people leave, they really don't have anywhere else to go but come back. And so what we find is that it does often take multiple occasions, multiple disasters to get a family or get a person to get communities to relocate altogether. And ultimately, you find that a lot of people try to stay in place because leaving is too risky because they don't have another source of income or another place to work or network for that matter. So that can be a big challenge as well. For Module 4, the biggest takeaways are that floods are acute hazards, but they're also layered with chronic threats, including poverty and exclusion from proper governance. Or let's say fair. Governance and equity undermine outcomes associated with flooding, right? And that's from every stage. That's from the early stage, from prior to the actual hazard itself, all the way through the rebuilding stage and to future disaster preparedness. Community resilience, however, is central to adaptation because where governance fails, community organizations, non-governmental organizations, nonprofits can also stand in the gap. And then lastly, moving forward, we will be talking about and connecting this topic to sea level rise and cultural displacement.